Excuse me, young lady. This seat isn't for people like you. The words hit like a slap across the cabin. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Passengers in business class froze with half-sipped wine glasses hovering near their lips. All eyes now focused on a single row 3A, where a teenage black girl sat quietly, earbuds in, clutching her phone, completely unaware of the storm brewing above her. Her name was Nia Carter, 16 years old, honor student, top of her class in Chicago, and winner of the National Youth Debate Championship. This was her first solo flight, a reward for her academic success, heading to Los Angeles to attend a leadership summit. She had chosen to fly business class not because she needed luxury, but because her mother insisted she travel safely and comfortably. Her mom, Nia Carter, just happened to be one of the top legal executives at the very airline they were flying with. But the flight attendant didn't know that. All the woman saw was a young black girl in a black hoodie, sneakers, curly hair, and a bun, quietly tapping on her phone, sitting in one of the most expensive seats on the plane. That image, so normal to some, triggered something ugly in the attendant. She leaned in aggressively. "I'm sorry, but you can't sit here. This is a business class seat. You need to go back to your assigned section before we take off." Nia pulled out one of her earbuds and blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" The flight attendant's voice got sharper. "I said you need to go back to your actual seat. This isn't yours. We can't delay takeoff just because someone decided to sneak into the wrong section." Passengers began whispering. Some looked confused, others amused. A man across the aisle took out his phone. One woman glanced at her husband and said under her breath, "This is going to be a scene." But Nia remained calm. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded boarding pass, and held it up. "Business class, seat 3A, confirmed." The flight attendant barely looked at it. "Did someone print this for you? This looks suspicious. Where's your guardian?" "I'm 16. I'm allowed to fly alone," Nia said, her voice low but steady. "And I paid for this ticket with my debate scholarship prize." That only seemed to irritate the woman more. "That's enough. I'm calling security." Click. The sound of her radio turning on. "Dispatch, I have a situation up front. Unauthorized minor in business class refusing to move." The message crackled across the intercom, just loud enough for the nearby rows to hear. Nia's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She looked down, then around, trying to gauge whether anyone would defend her. No one did. No one said a word, except a quiet elderly couple in 2C and 2D who looked visibly uncomfortable. The whispers grew louder. Some people shook their heads, but nobody stopped the humiliation. Then something shifted in Nia's eyes. She reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but with precision. She unlocked it, scrolled, and pressed a contact labeled Mom. She brought the phone to her ear. Her voice was low, controlled, and chillingly calm. "Mom, it's happening again. I'm on flight 726 to LAX, gate C12, seat 3A. She's yelling at me. She doesn't believe my ticket is real. Please do something." She ended the call without another word. The flight attendant scoffed. "Calling mommy isn't going to save you. Now get up before..." But before she could finish, the pilot's voice suddenly crackled through the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been instructed to delay takeoff due to a security matter. Please remain in your seats." Every head turned again, this time toward the cockpit. The flight attendant stiffened. Nia sat quietly. She didn't even look up. She just smiled barely. As the plane sat grounded and the tension buzzed like static in the air, very few people on board that flight truly knew who Nia Carter was. To most, she was just a teenage girl in a hoodie. But the truth was more complex, more powerful. Born and raised on the south side of Chicago, Nia Carter had never been a stranger to people's assumptions. She learned early that her skin color and zip code would cause others to underestimate her. Her mother, Nia Carter, a powerhouse attorney and single mother, had made it her mission to ensure her daughter never saw herself the way others tried to frame her. Danielle taught Nia to speak with clarity, to argue with truth, and to sit upright even when others tried to push her down. And Nia learned quickly. By the age of 12, Nia was debating high school seniors in public forums and winning. At 14, she was named Illinois Youth Speaker of the Year. At 15, she was accepted into a National Youth Summit for emerging leaders in social justice. At 16, she earned a full scholarship to participate in a university-sponsored think tank on systemic bias. This trip, the one she was currently on, was supposed to be her moment of celebration. Her first trip flying alone. Her reward for years of hard work. She had boarded the plane quietly with the confidence that came from knowing she belonged, even if others didn't think so. Her mom had double-checked everything: the ID, the ticket, the TSA pre-check status, and of course, the seat 3A. Business class. A seat paid in full with part of Nia's speaking honorarium from a recent TEDx youth event. Nia dressed simply that day. Black hoodie, dark jeans, her natural curls tied up in a puff. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't a celebrity or a daughter of royalty. She was just a girl who had worked hard and earned her place. But none of that mattered to the flight attendant. To her, Nia wasn't a brilliant student. She wasn't a scholarship winner. She wasn't the daughter of a high-powered attorney. She was just some kid in the wrong place. Nia could feel the judgment before the first word was even spoken. She saw it in the flight attendant's eyes the moment she stepped on the plane. That second glance, that pause, that small delay when checking her boarding pass longer than what she'd seen for the man in the expensive golf polo in front of her. It wasn't new, but it never got easier. She had hoped maybe naively that this flight would be different. She had been so excited that morning. She and her mom took a selfie outside the terminal, both grinning ear to ear. Her mom gave her a pep talk right at security stand tall Nia. Don't let anyone dim your shine. If something happens, call me immediately. Nia had nodded. I'll be fine, Mom. It's just a flight. Danielle had smiled, but behind her eyes was that same maternal worry, the kind only a black mother can understand when her child is about to step into a world that doesn't always see her fully. Now, sitting in 3R, her heart pounding after the confrontation, Nia thought back to that moment at the gate. How she had smiled, how she had believed. Her confidence was not built on arrogance. It was built on preparation and the constant pressure to be better, to prove herself, to never give anyone a reason to doubt her right to be in the room. And yet here she was being treated like a criminal because of a hoodie, because of her skin, because people sometimes need no more excuse than their own bias. Nia blinked back the heat in her eyes. She didn't want to cry, not here, not in front of the very people who chose to stay silent when she was being shouted at. Her hands clenched her phone. She had already made the call. Her mother was probably moving heaven and earth right now. Still, a part of her hated needing to make that call at all. She hated that her presence in this seat triggered a reaction violent enough to delay an entire flight. She hated the way the other passengers avoided eye contact with her now. The way they looked at her like she was radioactive. A threat, a problem, all for sitting in a seat she had every right to sit in. The irony was bitter, because Nia had just spent months researching bias in professional spaces. Her upcoming project presentation in LA was titled, Invisible Lines, the Cost of Assumptions on Young Black Minds. She never expected to live the thesis, en route to presenting it. Her phone buzzed in her lap. A single message from her mom, do not move, I'm coming. 3 words, calm, sharp, like a gavel hitting a courtroom bench. Nia took a deep breath. She looked out the airplane window, watching ground crew move aimlessly as the delay announcement spread. She could see 2 people in suits approaching the plane from the service side. The air in the cabin thickened. The passengers didn't know what was happening, but she did. Help was coming, and this time the world would know her name, not just as a victim, but as a symbol. A girl who refused to move. The seconds dragged into minutes. The cabin lights remained dimmed, yet the tension glowed brighter than ever. Nia sat stiffly in her seat, eyes locked on the screen of her phone, fingers gently tracing over her mother's final message. Do not move, I'm coming. She didn't move a muscle. She didn't dare. Every sound, the click of a seatbelt, the rustling of newspapers, even the hum of the air system, seemed to amplify the silence surrounding her. Across the aisle, the flight attendant stood frozen near the galley, whispering urgently into her radio. Her tone had shifted. No longer condescending, it now carried a sharp edge of nervousness. She glanced over her shoulder at Nia, then quickly looked away. From behind, a man in 4A leaned forward and muttered, not quite low enough. Why is she still here? They should have removed her already. A woman across the row replied, probably afraid of some lawsuit. You know how it is these days. The words didn't just sting, they roared. Nia heard every syllable like knives tossed at her back. Her hands tightened around her phone knuckles, pale against her dark skin. She didn't turn. She didn't reply. But her heart thumped hard against her chest and her throat thickened. All she had done was take her assigned seat. Nothing more. Yet she had become a spectacle, a disturbance, a topic of whispered debates in a cabin full of strangers. In that moment, Nia realized she wasn't just being treated as an inconvenience. She was being made into a warning. The flight attendant, whom Nia now learned was named Brenda, thanks to the side comments of nearby passengers, returned her steps cautious this time. Her voice, though forced into a professional tone, still carried the residue of irritation. We've received confirmation that someone is on the way to address the seating issue. Until then, you are to remain seated. Nia looked up slowly. This is my seat, she said evenly, her voice clear. Brenda's jaw tightened. Then we'll have it verified shortly. She didn't even try to check the boarding pass again. She turned and walked briskly toward the cockpit. From the far end of the business cabin, a woman with graying blonde hair stood and approached. She looked to be in her late 50s with a kind face, and the kind of confidence that came from years of knowing how to pick her battles. Sweetheart, she said gently to Nia, I saw what happened. I just wanted to say, I believe you. Her voice trembled slightly. My granddaughter is your age. I can't imagine her going through something like this alone. Nia looked up and smiled faintly. The woman placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You did nothing wrong. It was the first moment Nia had felt human again since the confrontation began. She gave a soft, thank you, and the woman returned to her seat quietly. A small ripple of discomfort swept through the nearby passengers. They had seen what happened, but none had spoken up until now. One by one, subtle shifts occurred. A man lowered his phone, stopping the video he had been quietly recording. A younger woman further back started typing something angrily into her notes app, then glanced toward the flight attendant. But still the silence remained dominant. Nobody wanted to be the second to stand. Moments later, an unfamiliar voice came through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've been informed of a delay due to a personnel clarification. Please remain calm. We appreciate your patience. The word choice didn't go unnoticed. Personnel clarification. Nia's brow furrowed. They were still trying to frame this as her fault, as if she were staff who wandered into the wrong section. Brenda passed again and made brief eye contact. This time, her confidence seemed to have evaporated. Her lips were tight, her expression unreadable. Nia wondered what Brenda had heard through the radio, what had changed and what was still coming. Her phone buzzed again. It was a new message from an unknown number. All it said was, Ms. Carter, I'm 5 minutes away. Stay seated. Nia showed no reaction, but inside a knot loosened in her chest. Reinforcements were on the way. At the rear of the cabin, the whispers now gave way to open murmurs. Someone said, why would a kid fake a ticket? Another replied, she literally showed the pass. That flight attendant never even scanned it. Another muttered, I think we're about to see someone get fired. But Nia didn't indulge in their theories. She stayed still, steady eyes forward, not out of fear, but from principle. Her mother had taught her the importance of poise in the face of insult. Let them stumble while you stay grounded. She thought about the moments earlier, the embarrassment, the rage. She thought about how her mother always reminded her, never let someone take your dignity unless they fight you for it. This wasn't a fight Nia had started, but it was one she would see through. Outside through the cabin window, she caught a glimpse of 2 black SUVs pulling up beside the terminal. The figures that exited were sharply dressed. One wore a badge on her belt, the other held a clipboard. Flight staff standing on the tarmac stiffened at their approach. Nia exhaled slowly. The cavalry had arrived. Inside the cabin, the energy shifted once more. Brenda was summoned to the front. She didn't return. The door to the jet bridge opened. And for the first time since Nia sat in 3A, the cabin was completely silent, not with tension, but with anticipation. The cabin lights flickered momentarily as the aircraft's auxiliary power adjusted to the delay, but no one was paying attention to that anymore. All eyes subtly drifted forward toward the front galley, toward the sealed cockpit door, toward the narrow corridor where something was clearly happening. Something big. Nia sat motionless in 3A, the echo of that last message, Ms. Carter. I'm 5 minutes away still rang in her mind. Her phone screen had dimmed, but she hadn't turned it off. She was waiting like a spark waits for oxygen. Brenda, the flight attendant who had caused this entire unraveling, hadn't returned since her final whisper into the radio. A different crew member walked down the aisle, now quietly doing routine checks, but everyone could sense it. The situation was no longer routine. And the silence, it was no longer passive. It was dense, heavy, expectant. Passengers leaned slightly into the aisle without making it obvious. A few turned off their screens. Someone near the back mumbled, they called corporate. This ain't gonna end well. Nia didn't look up. She stared at the window now, not for scenery, but for signals. And there it was. A woman in a gray tailored suit, heels clicking on the mobile stairway, emerged from the jet bridge door, flanked by a stern-looking man in navy slacks with a badge on his belt. They didn't look around. They moved with purpose. Inside the aircraft, a quiet ding preceded the unlocking of the cabin door. The sound made some passengers sit straighter. The captain opened the cockpit door just wide enough to step out, his posture stiff and unsure. As the two visitors entered, the co-pilot closed the door again. The woman in the gray suit stepped forward first, ignoring the rows of eyes locked on her. She had short coiled hair, a lanyard bearing a corporate ID, and a look on her face like she'd read every complaint letter in the airline's history and had memorized them all. She didn't introduce herself to the passengers. She didn't need to. She stopped next to the jump seat and turned to a no-return Brenda. Her voice was clear, but low enough not to alarm Brenda. "You're being relieved of service for this flight." Brenda's eyes widened. "What, wait, I followed protocol, she?" The woman cut her off without raising her voice. "That young woman in 3A is a paying customer, booked in business class, traveling independently with legal approval. You did not scan her ticket. You shouted at her. You threatened removal. You made a false call to security." She paused for half a second. "All of it is recorded." Passengers held their breath. The man in navy stepped forward gently but firmly, guiding Brenda toward the galley. She looked around, stunned, suddenly realizing the cameras on phones now pointed in her direction. Her voice faltered. "I didn't mean she looked so young," I thought. But no one defended her. No one stood for her. She disappeared behind the curtain with the man from corporate, and the rustle of hushed relief moved through the cabin like a breeze before a storm. Then the woman in the gray suit turned toward Nia. She walked with precision down the aisle and stopped directly next to seat 3A. Nia looked up, expression unreadable. The woman didn't smile. She didn't put on a customer service voice. She simply said, "Miss Carter, my name is Rachel Stanton. I'm the Regional Director of In-Flight Operations. I'm here on behalf of our executive team and on behalf of your mother." She extended her hand, not to shake, but to place a card onto the tray table. "We sincerely apologize for everything that just occurred. This delay will not be counted against your travel record. Your fare will be refunded in full, and your mother has been notified of our actions." Nia nodded, still silent. But then she asked, "Did you believe me?" The woman looked her square in the eye. "Yes." It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't shouted, but in that cabin at that moment it landed like thunder. Rachel turned to the rest of the cabin and spoke louder. "For everyone on board, we apologize for the delay. We are taking steps to ensure this does not happen again. This flight will depart shortly. Thank you for your patience." As she returned to the front of the plane, passengers began to murmur. But now it was different. A few people softly clapped. Others looked toward Nia with new respect, some with guilt. One woman, previously silent, leaned forward and said, "I should have said something. I'm sorry." Nia offered a short smile, not out of forgiveness, but understanding. Because Nia had never expected this moment to teach her something about justice. She had only hoped it wouldn't teach her about silence. Now she had both. The engines began to hum. The aircraft doors sealed. The taxi instructions played. And for the first time since Nia sat in her seat, she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in power. The fight wasn't over. But she had won this round. The hum of the engines began to rise as the flight crew prepared for departure. But the emotional current flowing through the cabin had shifted entirely. Nia Carter remained seated in 3A, her headphones now resting gently around her neck, her phone still unlocked in her hand. She didn't need to record anything. What had happened, what was still happening, was being recorded in the minds of every person aboard. But one thing was certain: she was no longer the girl being questioned. She was now the center of gravity in the cabin. Rachel Stanton, the regional executive who had entered like a storm in a tailored suit, had returned to the front of the plane. Her voice was low as she conferred with the captain, her body language authoritative but calm. Meanwhile, the other flight attendants moved carefully around the business class section, avoiding eye contact with Nia and with each other, as if fearful that one wrong gesture would bring the wrath of accountability crashing down again. Nia sat upright, her back no longer pressed against the seat but held firm with a quiet strength. She wasn't angry, at least not outwardly. She wasn't crying. She wasn't gloating. But her stillness carried a weight heavier than any speech could have. In the rows around her, passengers began to stir. The elderly woman who had earlier offered comfort now leaned toward the aisle and quietly spoke to the man across from her. "You saw it too, didn't you?" she asked. That attendant didn't even check her pass. He nodded, guilt written plainly across his face. I thought about saying something. I really did. But I just didn't want to get involved. She looked him in the eyes. Not getting involved is getting involved. Behind them, a woman who had been silently watching everything began typing furiously into her phone. Another man muttered, I have a daughter about her age. I'd want someone to speak up for her. People who had once looked away were now confronting themselves and each other. The confrontation wasn't just between Nia and Brenda anymore. It had expanded into something bigger, a confrontation with the cabin's collective conscience. Nia caught some of the murmurs. She wasn't naive. She knew the apology she'd received didn't erase what happened. But she also knew something had changed. She could feel it in the way people looked at her now, not with suspicion, but with recognition. She hadn't demanded power. She had claimed her place quietly, resolutely. And now others had to adjust. The aircraft door closed with a hiss. The jet bridge was retracted. The captain's voice returned over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We've been cleared for pushback. Please fasten your seatbelts. But before takeoff could begin, Rachel Stanton stepped into the aisle once more and addressed the passengers in business class, this time not as a corporate figure, but as a person. I know this has been a challenging start to your flight, she said, her voice steady. What happened today is not just about protocol, it's about perception. We cannot and will not allow anyone, especially a young person, to be treated as suspicious for simply being where they belong. She looked directly at Nia as she said the last words. This company is committed to doing better. I hope you hold us to that. Then she handed out small cards to the surrounding rows, cards offering direct feedback channels, not generic surveys, but direct links to the executive office. Please don't let silence be your legacy on this flight, she added gently. A murmur of agreement rippled through the seats. After she returned to her seat, the silence returned, but it wasn't awkward this time. It was reflective. The aircraft began its slow taxi to the runway. As the ground moved beneath them, Nia turned her head to the side and caught her own reflection faintly in the window. A young black girl in a hoodie seated in business class, surrounded by eyes that once doubted her, now unsure where to look. And then something unexpected happened. A flight attendant, not Brenda, but a younger man, walked over quietly and crouched beside her seat. I just wanted to say, he began, his voice low enough not to draw attention. I'm sorry you went through that. I should have stepped in sooner. I didn't. Nia turned to him, eyes steady. I appreciate that, she said. He nodded, hesitated, then added, if you need anything, water blanket, anything at all, just let me know. I will. He stood and walked away a bit lighter, as if the confession had untied a knot in his chest. The plane rolled into position on the runway. Engines roared, the cabin tilted, and they were airborne. The view outside the window expanded into sky and clouds, but the real ascent had already begun back on the ground. Because Nia hadn't just boarded a plane, she had disrupted a pattern. And maybe, just maybe, she'd helped land a little more truth inside a place that desperately needed it. By the time Flight 726 soared above the clouds, Nia Carter had become more than just a teenage passenger. She had become a symbol. 30,000 feet below her name was already trending. It started with a tweet, a blurry photo from row 5A. The caption read, Flight attendant tried to kick a black teen out of business class. Turns out her mom's a top exec. Planes delayed. People are squirming. That post hit 10,000 likes before the flight even left the tarmac. Then came the second wave, a TikTok clip, 13 seconds of the flight attendant raising her voice, followed by the calm voice of Nia saying, I paid for this seat. The overlay text read, she didn't know who she was messing with. Millions watched and shared and commented. But Nia didn't know any of that yet. She was still in seat 3A, watching sunlight dance off the tips of clouds. Her phone was on airplane mode. She sat silently as the captain announced their cruising altitude, unaware that her face had already appeared on 3 news aggregation sites and a dozen influencer accounts. Across the aisle, the tension had settled into reflection. Passengers who had watched in silence earlier now exchanged looks, some embarrassed, some introspective. A businessman near the front wrote an email to his daughter. A college professor jotted a note for his ethics lecture. One woman in her 60s began composing a Facebook post today. I watched a young girl stand her ground with more grace than most adults I know. But there were also those who remained quiet, not because they didn't care, but because the confrontation had revealed something uncomfortable in themselves. And discomfort, unlike anger, doesn't always have a sound. In the galley, two remaining attendants whispered urgently. "You think she's getting fired?" one asked. Brenda, the other, replied. "She was already escorted off. She's done." They paused, then lowered their voices even more. "Did you hear the girl's last name? Carter?" "Yeah, that's Danielle Carter's daughter. Danielle Carter, legal exec. The one who rewrote the harassment policy last year." They both fell silent, suddenly realizing how close they had come to being part of something much bigger than a customer service mistake. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain received another message. The company's PR team was requesting a discreet landing. No press access at the gate, no recorded statements. He sighed, rubbed his forehead, and replied, "Understood." But outside their control, the world was already talking. A journalist from a major online magazine tweeted witnesses say a black teen was falsely accused and almost removed from her flight. Now we know her mother is a senior legal executive at the airline. Developing, more stories followed, hashtags multiplied, where Nia Carter, Junior business class bias, she belonged here. Back in seat 3A, Nia stared at her reflection in the screen of her phone. She hadn't opened any apps. She wasn't checking notifications. She was just sitting with it all. Her mother had taught her the value of stillness. Sometimes she used to say, "Your calm is the loudest response in the room." And that's what Nia had done. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She had stood her ground with posture, with words, with the truth. She didn't know yet that her actions were inspiring thousands of other girls to comment, "This is why we speak up. She's my hero today. That's how you carry your crown." From her seat, she simply closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled. It was the first time since takeoff that her body relaxed. Then came a soft voice beside her. It was the pilot. He had left the cockpit briefly and now stood at her row, kneeling slightly so as not to tower over her. "Miss Carter," he began, voice low and respectful, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. On behalf of the crew, on behalf of this flight. What happened was wrong. We're going to do better." She opened her eyes slowly and nodded. "I know you didn't cause the delay," he continued, "but you did cause something else. You reminded us what happens when people stop accepting disrespect as routine." Nia didn't say anything at first. Then with a soft but firm tone, she replied, "People treat you like you don't belong, until someone in power reminds them you do." The pilot gave her a quiet smile. "Well," he said, "you reminded them without needing anyone else." Then he stood, tipped his head slightly, and returned to the cockpit. Nia turned her gaze back to the window. Outside, the clouds stretched in long golden ribbons. The sun was dipping lower, casting a soft amber hue across the sky. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down. The lock screen lit up 54 unread notifications, and just beneath that, one text from her mother. It read, "I'm proud of you. All of America's watching, but I'm just proud of you." Nia smiled. Then, for the first time since boarding the flight, she leaned back fully into her seat. As Flight 726 descended toward Los Angeles International Airport, the golden hue of sunset faded into the indigo of early evening. Inside the cabin, the passengers sat quietly, their tray tables locked and seats upright, but no one was thinking about luggage or Uber pickups. Everyone aboard knew they had witnessed something bigger than a delayed flight. The final 20 minutes of airtime felt heavier than the 6 hours they had just spent soaring over the country. Nia Carter looked out the window as the city lights bloomed beneath her like scattered diamonds. It should have been a moment of excitement, of anticipation for the leadership summit she was invited to attend. Instead, it felt like she was about to step into something far larger than any workshop or panel discussion. As the wheels touched down and the aircraft rolled toward the gate, the captain's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. On behalf of the crew, thank you for your patience today. Please remain seated until we arrive at the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. We wish you a safe and meaningful stay." The words were neutral, measured, but the last phrase, "a safe and meaningful stay," felt deliberate, a quiet nod to what had transpired. Nia didn't move. She stayed in her seat, her headphones still looped around her neck, her posture calm but alert. Her phone buzzed again and again as the cabin reconnected to the world below. The notifications multiplied, dozens, then hundreds. DMs, mentions, texts from unfamiliar numbers and news outlets. But one message stood out. It was from her mom. "There will be press. Don't talk to anyone yet. I'll meet you at the terminal. Walk strong." The plane pulled into the gate. The engines whirred down. The overhead lights flickered back to full brightness. Passengers stood one by one, reaching for bags, murmuring goodbyes, stealing glances back at Nia. some with admiration, others with guilt, and a few with deep respect. As the cabin door opened, a ground agent stepped aboard walking straight to seat 3A. She smiled warmly. "Miss Carter," she asked. Nia stood slowly and nodded. "Yes. I've been assigned to escort you directly. Your mother's waiting near the executive arrivals entrance." Nia collected her small carry-on and stepped into the aisle. The walk through the plane felt longer than it actually was. Every row she passed held eyes watching her. Not in judgment now, but in witness. She walked tall, not with arrogance, but with a quiet dignity sharpened by hours of silent resilience. She exited the aircraft. The hallway to the terminal was unusually empty. A second uniformed agent led her swiftly past the main gates. "We routed you through a side corridor," the woman explained softly. "There's press outside the regular arrivals gate. We didn't want them surrounding you." "Thank you," Nia said, adjusting her hoodie slightly. At the end of the hallway, glass doors slid open. Standing in front of them was Nia Carter, flawless as ever in a deep navy blazer heels, planted firmly, eyes locked on her daughter, with equal parts fire and pride. Nia's pace quickened. They embraced. Not a dramatic camera-ready hug, but something deep, knowing, unbreakable. Danielle pulled back just enough to look Nia in the eyes. "You did everything right," she said. "You didn't raise your voice. You didn't back down. You stood tall even when they tried to shrink you." Nia's voice was soft. "I just wanted to get to the summit." "You will," her mom said. "But first we're going to handle what happened, properly." Behind them, a private car was already waiting. As they slid into the back seat, Danielle handed Nia an iPad. On the screen were the headlines: "Teen targeted on flight fights back with grace," and one powerful phone call. "CEO's legal director slams airline's own staff after her daughter faces bias." Nia Carter becomes a movement overnight. Nia scrolled in silence, absorbing the digital storm erupting around her. "This wasn't the plan," she finally said. "No," her mother replied. "It was bigger." Outside, the press swarmed the public exit, unaware that the story's subject had already slipped quietly into the night. As they rode toward the hotel, Nia watched the city blur past. Billboards, headlights, palm trees in silhouette. Somewhere out there, she knew, were people still arguing in comment threads, reposting videos, drawing conclusions from a 30-second clip of a 6-hour journey. But Nia didn't feel the need to explain herself to the world. She had already done enough. Danielle placed a hand on her daughter's arm. "Tomorrow we'll talk to the board," she said. "And after that, we'll meet with the DEI team. But tonight you rest. You earned that seat and you defended it. That's more than most grown men can say." Nia leaned her head against the window, finally letting her shoulders drop. Outside, the city of Los Angeles glowed like a stage. And for the first time, she felt like the spotlight didn't blind her. It just lit the path forward. By the following morning, the story had become national news. Major media outlets ran headlines like, "Teen passenger stands her ground in business class bias incident." "Viral video shows teen calmly confronting discrimination on flight." "Daughter of airline exec exposes in-house bias company, promises review." But none of the headlines quite captured the stillness of it, the poise. The way Nia Carter sat in seat 3A, not with defiance, but with quiet certainty. She hadn't marched through an airport waving protest signs. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't cursed. She had simply stayed seated, refusing to shrink into the background when someone decided she didn't belong. And in doing so, she had changed everything. Inside the airline's headquarters, Danielle Carter entered the boardroom with her legal team behind her. No makeup, no press smiles, just the presence of a mother and a professional who had seen too much to be impressed by polished apologies. At the far end of the table sat the CEO, a tall man with a military haircut and a crisis in his inbox. "I've already accepted Brenda's resignation," he began. Danielle raised a hand. "This isn't about one flight attendant." He paused. She continued, "This is about a culture that allowed her to act on a bias she didn't even think to question. It's about every passenger who's ever been humiliated and didn't have someone powerful to call. It's about how my daughter at 16 knew she had to record her dignity like evidence." He opened his mouth to reply, but closed it again. Danielle pulled out her phone. "I don't want compensation. I want systemic retraining. I want the DEI team reporting directly to legal, not PR. I want implicit bias training for all flight staff, not once but annually. And I want a seat at the table to review the policy updates myself." The room went silent. She looked each board member in the eye. Because if your own senior executive's child isn't safe in your cabin, what happens to everyone else's? Meanwhile, across the country, students at Nia's high school had already printed out her now viral image, her sitting calmly as an angry hand pointed in her face and taped it to their lockers with the caption, "Know your seat. Keep your seat." A teacher paused her lecture mid-class to say, "This week's debate assignment, how one act of quiet resistance changed a nationwide conversation." Elsewhere, passengers who had been on that flight gave interviews. Some praised Nia, others admitted their silence. One woman said through tears, "I watched her being accused, and I said nothing. I will never do that again." Social media exploded with reactions. Activists praised Nia's grace under pressure. Politicians reposted clips drawing comparisons to Rosa Parks. A best-selling author tweeted, "We don't need superheroes. We need young girls who sit down and say, 'I belong here.'" But Nia stayed quiet. She skipped the media circuit. She declined morning show invitations. Her mother told her she didn't owe the world her pain for content. Instead, Nia sat by the hotel pool that afternoon, hoodie on, sunglasses shielding her from curious stares. In her lap was a journal. No hashtags, no filters, just her pen. She wrote, "I didn't know sitting down could make this much noise. I didn't know silence could echo louder than yelling, but now I do. And I know I won't ever sit quietly when someone else gets treated the way I did." Her phone buzzed. Another text from her mom. "Tomorrow a reporter is flying in. Only if you want to speak." She stared at the screen, then back at the journal. Then she typed back, "Maybe not yet, but someday I want to speak not just about what happened to me, but what happens every day to girls like me." Across the hotel, the head of the summit planning team approached cautiously. "Nia, we weren't sure you'd still want to speak tomorrow, but we'd be honored." Nia closed the journal and stood. "I'll speak," she said. "Do you want us to change your topic?" She shook her head. "No, I think invisible lines fits better now than ever." The woman smiled gently, touched her arm, and nodded. The next day, Nia stepped onto the stage. She didn't talk about the flight. She didn't need to. Instead, she told a story about what happens when people decide who deserves to sit where. About how bias isn't always loud, it's often a glance, a pause, a second guess. She told the room, "They didn't question my seat because it was wrong. They questioned it because it was mine." That's what bias does. It doesn't need proof. It just needs doubt. And when she ended her speech, the room didn't just clap. They stood. A standing ovation for the girl who didn't stand up because she didn't have to. She already belonged. 2 weeks had passed since the incident on Flight 726, but the echoes of that day had only grown louder. Nia Carter returned home to Chicago to find murals being painted across her neighborhood. One showed a silhouette of a girl seated in a plane seat, head high, with the words, "You belong here." Her story was no longer just news. It had become a movement. Across the country, major airlines rolled out new anti-bias training. They didn't say it directly, but everyone knew this was because of Nia. One airline created a new slogan for their internal staff posters: "The right seat is the one you earn, not the one others expect you to take." Her name was now cited in diversity strategy meetings in schools and training modules. But for Nia, the changes that meant the most weren't on headlines or slideshows. They were in the letters, hundreds of them, from girls she'd never met. One read, "Dear Nia, I'm a 14-year-old girl from North Carolina. Last week, my teacher assumed I didn't belong in the honors section. I remembered your story. I stood up for myself. She apologized. Thank you." Another said, "My mom is a cleaner at the airport. She said the crew has been treating her differently since what happened to you. Like they suddenly remembered she matters." And then there were messages from crew members. One wrote, "I've worked as a flight attendant for 12 years. Watching that video made me cry. I saw myself in Brenda. That scared me. I'll do better." For Nia, that mattered more than any applause, more than any article, because change didn't live in the spotlight. It lived in the mirror. One evening, Nia sat with her mom in the living room, sorting through the stack of handwritten letters. Danielle poured tea while Nia read one aloud about a girl who now dared to apply to her dream university because Nia didn't let fear tell her where she belonged. Danielle smiled. "You've done more in 2 weeks than some do in a lifetime." Nia tilted her head. "All I did was sit still." "That's why it mattered," her mom said. "You stayed where you were told you didn't belong. You didn't ask for permission to exist." Later that night, Nia posted for the first time since the incident. Her caption was short. "To every girl ever questioned for where she sat, stood, or spoke, this seat is for you too." Within minutes, it went viral again. But this time, the comments weren't shock or outrage. They were solidarity. Teachers printed her post and taped it to classroom doors. Moms read it aloud to daughters before school. A youth center in Oakland painted it across their lobby wall. Even celebrities chimed in, not just sharing the post, but telling their own stories of being dismissed, underestimated, excluded. Nia's page flooded with responses, but she didn't log on to count followers. She wasn't chasing attention. She was reclaiming space, and not just for herself. One morning, a call came from the airline's new vice president of diversity and ethics, a role created 2 days after Nia Carter presented a list of non-negotiables to the board. Nia, the voice said, "We'd like to invite you to speak at our company's annual leadership summit." Nia hesitated. "I'm not a speaker," she replied. "Yes, you are," the woman said. "You just didn't choose the first stage you stood on. This time you get to say what you really want on your own terms." That phrase stuck with her. On your own terms. So she agreed. A month later, Nia stood in front of a room of executives, pilots, crew, and board members. She didn't read from a script. She didn't retell the flight story. She told them a truth they didn't expect. Bias isn't just shouting. Sometimes it's a whisper, a second guess, a pause where there should be welcome. I didn't need to be screamed at to know I wasn't seen. I didn't need to be removed to feel erased. But I stayed. And I stayed not because I wanted a fight, but because that seat was mine. And now my story is being used to teach others how to look closer, to pause before they assume. I'm not a hero. I'm a reminder. A reminder that dignity doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. When she finished, no one clapped right away. They just stood in silence. And then the room erupted. Later, several attendants came up to her, not just to thank her, but to ask her what they could read, how they could understand better. Nia recommended a book her mom gave her years ago. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? She signed her name into a few copies of it. On the flight home, she sat in business class again. This time, no one questioned her seat. In fact, the crew offered her water with reverence. But more importantly, no one looked twice. And for the first time, that felt like progress. She took a breath, reclined back, and pulled out her journal. At the top of the page, she wrote, "They changed the system because I didn't move." Months had passed since the flight. The media storm had quieted. The hashtags had faded into the archive of digital memory. But something more permanent had taken root, something quieter, deeper, and more transformative. At a small regional airport in Georgia, a young girl stood at the check-in counter, her hands trembling slightly as she handed over her boarding pass. She was wearing a hoodie just like Nia had, and clutched a beat-up paperback novel in her hand. The airline attendant scanned her pass, looked at her name, then at her face and smiled. "You're in business class today, right?" The girl nodded. "Have a wonderful flight, Miss Taylor. You deserve it." No second glance, no suspicion, just a welcome. She walked away smiling. That same week at a university in Seattle, a first-year student cited the Carter incident in her sociology paper on racial profiling and invisible bias. In Boston, a nonprofit launched a scholarship called the 3A Fund to support Black girls pursuing leadership training. And in Memphis, a high school English class studied Nia's summit speech alongside the works of Maya Angelou and Audre Lorde. None of it had been planned. Nia hadn't started a movement with intention. She had simply refused to move. And because of that, others could. Back in Chicago, the Carter household had returned to a sense of normalcy. Sort of. Nia still got stopped on the street by strangers who whispered thank yous. She still received letters from students, educators, even CEOs. But she didn't center her life around that moment anymore, because she was focused on what came next. She had applied and been accepted into 3 pre-law programs. She started volunteering with a local youth advocacy group, and she began mentoring younger girls who had experienced discrimination in school and public spaces. Her life wasn't defined by that flight, but it was shaped by it. One fall afternoon, Nia and her mom walked through a small garden near their neighborhood library. The leaves were beginning to turn shades of red and amber, drifting through the breeze. Danielle looked at her daughter not as a viral figure, not as a hero, but as a young woman growing into her voice. "I still remember how calm you were," she said. Nia chuckled. "I wasn't calm, I was shaking. You didn't look it." They paused at a bench and sat. Danielle asked, "If you could go back, would you do anything differently?" Nia shook her head. "No, because if I had stood up, they would have won. I would have been the problem, the angry Black girl. But by staying seated, I made them explain themselves. I made them uncomfortable with their own actions, not mine." Her mother smiled. "That's the mark of a leader." Nearby, 2 teenage girls sat reading under a tree. One of them wore a pin that said, "Seat 3A." Nia noticed. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. That was the point. The story wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to every young person who'd been told they didn't fit, every girl who'd been questioned, dismissed, underestimated. It belonged to anyone who had ever doubted their right to be seen. Weeks later, Nia boarded a flight again. This time she was traveling with a group of student activists headed to DC for a youth policy summit. As she approached the boarding gate, a young male gate agent paused mid-scan and looked at her, then smiled. "Welcome aboard, Miss Carter. Thank you for everything." She nodded. "Happy to be here." She boarded and found her seat 3A. This time, no one questioned her. But more importantly, she didn't have to question herself. She sat down, buckled in, looked out the window, and exhaled. As the plane lifted from the runway and soared into the sky, Nia didn't feel burdened by the past. She felt lifted by it, because that single seat on that single day had become something much bigger. It had become a declaration, a refusal, a legacy. And now, just like the plane rising above the clouds, she was moving forward. Not for attention, not for justice already won, but for the next girl who would sit in that same seat and never once wonder if she belonged there.